Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good afternoon. The King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies is pleased to welcome you today to discuss the recently published report by Dr. David Kenner and Camille Ahmed titled The US-Saudi Economic Relationship, More Than Arms and Oil. The authors of this report highlight the ways the historical allegiance between Saudi Arabia and the US is rooted not only in geopolitical security issues, but in longstanding private and public economic cooperation and a history of cultural exchange. Over the past 5 years, Vision 2030 has outlined ambitious economic development strategies to enable the country to diversify its non-oil economy in new and creative ways, as well as stimulate cultural and social transformation across a variety of sectors. And while the Biden administration may have appeared apprehensive about its approach to Saudi-US relations during the presidential campaign, this report highlights how deeply embedded the relationship between the two countries is, and furthermore, how incredibly beneficial fostering this relationship is, especially in the coming years and in light of economic opportunities and cooperation under Vision 2030. And finally, as the world slowly emerges from the paralysis of a global pandemic and countries reevaluate opportunities for collaboration in battling the next set of global challenges, it's imperative that the US use this time to reestablish themselves as intelligent, competent players on the global scene in order to continue to use their influence to overcome disruptive forces. And it's also imperative that Saudi Arabia's continuous efforts to transform future prospects for the better are recognized as an opportunity for collaboration and for cooperation to continue to be pursued. I'll now turn to Dr. Neil Qiyam, Senior Research Fellow with the King Faisal Center and Associate Fellow with Chatham House Middle East and North Africa Program, who will introduce our esteemed panelists. Please do use the Q&A feature in Zoom to ask our panelists any questions, and you'll also be able to download the reference report in English and Arabic from the chat box. Over to you, Neil.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I'm delighted to chair today's webinar. And as the title suggests, US-Saudi economic relationship, more than arms and oil, is extremely timely. It'll give us the opportunity to discuss the Biden administration and some of those issues that you've just raised, Hannah. Also, it seems very timely given the sort of three announcements we've heard this week from the kingdom, sort of the Made in Saud program, the Sharik program, and climate change program. So it'll be very interesting to sort of see how this sort of sits within that framework. Just in terms of format, we have an hour. I will invite very shortly David and Camille to speak, and they'll speak for approximately 20 minutes between the two of them. I'll ask a couple of questions to sort of share that and hope Hannah will join into that. And then we'll take audience questions. Just to reinforce the point, please do put in your questions into the Q&A box and do so as soon as you wish, because we'll soon pick those up. Now, about our speakers today, David Kenner is a visiting fellow at the King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies and a fellow at the Institute of Current World Affairs, a Washington, D.C. based think tank. His research focuses on the US-Saudi economic relationship and the Vision 2030 reforms underway in Saudi Arabia. His prior work concerns GCC and Middle Eastern economies' efforts to pursue the twin goals of strengthening the private sector and promoting private employment. So yesterday's announcement is very particular to this, with a particular focus on Saudi efforts to attract greater foreign investment. That's something I'm sure we're going to discuss in some detail. Simultaneously, his research aims to understand regional variances within Saudi Arabia in making progress towards this economic transition. He's a graduate of Georgetown University and the American University of Beirut and is currently in Beirut. And our second speaker, Camille Ahmed, is a junior research fellow at KFCRIS. He joined the center in July 2018. Before joining the center, he was an intern at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Camille obtained his BA in International Relations and Political Science from San Norbert College. His research interests encompass US foreign policy and national security, US-Latin American relations, and US policies towards the Middle East. Currently, he serves as a visiting fellowship program officer. And with that, I will hand over to you, David. let you speak for about 15 minutes, sort of set out your key points from the paper, and then we'll sort of hand smoothly over to Camille. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Quilliam. I really appreciate the very kind introduction and the opportunity to speak about our paper. It was a really fascinating research project. And I think, first of all, I'm not going to speak too long because I always think these things are very nice and better when there's a little give and take with questions. And I'm also going to try not to drown you in too many facts and figures. So let me just highlight some major themes that stood out to me from the research of this paper and the writing of this paper. The first is just the growing scope of the economic relationship. US firms have operated in Saudi Arabia since the foundation of the modern kingdom. So in some ways, this is an expansion of pre-existing business. But in past decades, the economic relationship was really the domain of several large US companies with focus on energy, arms, and infrastructure. Aramco obviously began its life as an American company. Bechtel built the kingdom's first railways and airports. And as you'll see in the paper, U.S. firms associated with the Coca-Cola company actually built the first desalination plants in the kingdom. But what we have seen is that the scope of the relationship has expanded dramatically in the past 2 decades, and that has brought in an increasingly diverse group of US firms. To add a few facts and figures in this analysis, the US sold $14.3 billion in goods to Saudi Arabia in 2019. That's an increase from under $6 billion in 2001. The exports of services have also grown from 2.3 billion in 2005 to 9.4 billion in 2019, driven by an increase in travel and financial services mainly. Together, all of this business supports roughly 165,000 American jobs. We also see a concomitant increase in Saudi investment in the United States. This comes from a variety of avenues. Saudi Arabia holds, for example, over $130 billion in US Treasury securities, up from roughly $12 billion in 2000. The Public Investment Fund is a major investor in US equity markets and holds almost $13 billion in US stocks as of the last quarterly report. Of course, there's also a substantial direct investment from Saudi firms in the United States, which I'll discuss in greater detail shortly. So the relationship has also grown more diverse in recent years. This is partially the result of regulatory reforms and also the opening up of new sectors for investment as part of the Vision 2030 reforms. One of the most prominent, of course, is the kingdom's tourism and entertainment sectors. Officials from the General Entertainment Authority and Ministry of Sport see partnerships with US firms as a way to attract attention to large events, stoke domestic interest in these new sectors, and build the capacity of local partners. One of my favorite examples, though it is not a US firm partnership, is the Rally Dakar. The Ministry of Sport gave the Saudi Motorsport Federation a prominent role in organizing the event. And so the Motorsport Federation organized 6 qualifying events for Saudi talent across the country. And those who won those qualifying events participated in the Central Rally Dakar. So in this way, the tentpole international events served to support a series of local contests involving exclusively Saudi talent and sort of promoted the building up of a within entertainment options, including everything from restaurants to circus performances. It's been really impressive. Another sign of the increasing diversification of the economic relationship is the mining sector, though it's not in the public spotlight in the same way as tourism and entertainment. But arguably, business perspective. Over the past decade, 3 American firms have launched multi-billion-dollar joint ventures with the Saudi mining company Ma'aden. All of them are among the top 10 largest US-Saudi joint ventures in the country. Finally, I just want to highlight that the people-to-people links are just as important, if not more so, than the business-to-business links. Saudi student enrollment in US universities surged starting in 2004, Over the last 2 decades, Saudi students have enrolled in more than 500,000 academic years worth of education in the United States. Their presence has contributed almost $14 billion to the US economy since then. Saudi Arabia has also donated at least $390 million to US universities during that period, and most likely significant more. So the third theme I just want to highlight is the gaps in our knowledge, how we know what we know, and what still remains to be improved. One thing that's important to note is that the cultural exchange still remains a one-way street in some ways. Only 80,000 Americans live or visited Saudi Arabia every year, a number that is dwarfed by the Saudis visiting the United States. The Saudi Ministry of Investment is aiming to correct this knowledge gap by recently opening offices worldwide and taking a much more proactive stance to attracting foreign investment to the kingdom, which is obviously also aligned with the Vision 2030 goals. One of the gaps in our knowledge also remains that we know far more about US investment in Saudi Arabia than Saudi investment in the United States. That is because the US Commerce Department conducts confidential surveys of US firms to determine their investment stock abroad. That's how I can tell you that the cumulative level of US investment in Saudi Arabia reached 10.8 billion in 2019. But there is no comparable survey conducted by the Saudi Ministry of Investment to determine the extent of Saudi foreign direct investment in the United States. And there's no mechanism to determine the owner of a business in the United States. A Saudi businessman, like any businessman, either American or foreign, can easily establish a limited liability corporation in the United States, which makes it difficult to understand who owns what. The irony of this is that Saudi policymakers increasingly want to know this information about how their businessmen are investing in major in partners abroad. They want to highlight how the bonds between Saudi Arabia and the United States have been strengthened in recent years to the mutual benefit of both countries. I just want to close by saying increasing the information available to policymakers and researchers is an excellent way for them to make their case and to help us understand the important economic linkages that bind both countries. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You've given us a lot of food for thought there and sort of entry points for questions. So we look forward to taking those shortly. Camille, if I could ask you to come forward and continue the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Neff, and thanks to David. I want to add a little more to what has already been said regarding the report. I'm sure most of the attendees here are familiar with the common portrayal of the Saudi-US relationship, and that is portrayed as oil for security kind of relationship. But the fact is, it's more complex than that. And that's why the idea of the report originated, to unearth and discuss topics of the two states' economic ties, and to have a better understanding of what the overall economic cooperation. Following the research process we have done to address those facts, we reached a conclusion that arms and oil sales are a significant element, but they are far from being the only ties linking the two countries. I would like to also add to why the report is important, and especially at this time. Since the announcement of the Saudi Vision 2030, Saudi Arabia took major steps toward diversifying its economy by doubling its investments abroad. One of the main destinations of those investments is in the United States. The US has been a favored destination for Saudi Arabia's investment since the 1970s. And the Saudi direct investment in the United States reached to the level of $14.9 billion in 2017 and stood at $13.2 billion in 2019. It is estimated that those investments created more than 8,500 jobs for American workers. One of the major investments we discuss in the report is Saudi Aramco's investments in Motiva Enterprises, which is the largest oil refinery in North America. Motiva used to be a joint venture between Saudi Aramco and Shell until Aramco acquired full ownership in 2017. The company employs 2,700 workers and its total assets is $13.8 billion. The Saudi Basic Industries Corporation, SABIC, also signed a multi-billion-dollar joint venture with ExxonMobil in June 2019 to build a petrochemical facility in Texas. The project is expected to create more than 600 jobs and to generate $50 billion in the first 6 years of operation. Saudi investments in the United States are not only in oil and gas. If we take, for example, the dairy company, Al Marahi, it owns about a total of 27,000 acres in California and Arizona. Al Alayan Group is another Saudi-owned company with an office in New York that oversees the company's investments in financial and communication companies, consumer product manufacturers, and real estate. Yet, those numbers do not represent a comprehensive view of the Saudi investments in the United States. As my friend David mentioned, while the US law requires US firms to disclose their FDI abroad, the Saudi government does not publish data about the activities of its firms. Still, those kinds of investments are mutually beneficial and bonds the two countries together. And to conclude, I would say that people who limit the US relations on oil for arms misses the fact that arms and oil sales constitute a relatively small percentage of the overall trade between the two countries. Back to you, David.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Camille. If I could just pick up on that last point you made. I mean, you've really sort of highlighted the multidimensional nature of the relationship, and sort of sat here in London, I quite often get asked by the media, questions about defense and oil and UK Saudi relations, and my sort of stock phrase is, well, the relationship is multidimensional, and you've both illustrated that and sort of the depth of the relationship through other means. Why do you think this perception sort of persists that the relationship is defense and oil related only? And to what extent in Saudi Arabia itself is it understood that the relationship is much more complex than that? I mean, it's often a sort of media shorthand, but why would you sort of attribute the relationship being sort of just conceptualized on those two small points? Thank you.
I think as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, this is the way the report idea originated. Yeah, because many of the as you said, many of people understood the relationship only for arms and oil between the two countries, and because of the lack of the research conducted on the overall trade relationship between the two countries, and to give a more comprehensive overview of the relationship, we're still lacking a lot of research into this topic. So I think this report is a good start to give a better understanding of this topic, and hopefully to see more research into that.
Great, thank you, David. If I could ask you, I mean, you've sort of you've related in the report, you go back quite a number of years to sort of say how the relationship has developed over time. I mean, how would you characterize the economic relationship, say, over the past 5 years? And if you were to project five years forward, how would you imagine that relationship then being characterized?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, I think what we're seeing is, I really think the diversification angle is an important one to sort of emphasize when looking at this. You just see an incredible diversity and an incredible number of US firms entering the market that you didn't see previously. I mean, just speaking about Riyadh season alone, I mean, the sort of one of the last major entertainment sort of centerpieces in the kingdom before COVID-19. You saw Broadway shows come, you saw musical acts like Imagine Dragons, you saw entertainment events sponsored by Marvel Entertainment, World Wrestling Entertainment, you saw Pepsi, MasterCard, Visa, McDonald's all take major sponsorship roles. These were not the sort of companies that were playing a major role in the US-Saudi economic partnership in years past. So I do think, and speaking to Saudi officials, speaking to US businessmen, they see a lot of advantages in Saudi Arabia because they see it as a largely untapped market. They see it as a place where they don't have established rivals. They see it as a place where there's sort of substantial government support for these reform efforts, financial support for them to sort of build the base of industry. So I expect we will see an increasing diversification the economic relationship. Medium-sized enterprises that previously would not have seen a point of entry to Saudi Arabia, that wouldn't have understood how to enter the Saudi market, are increasingly starting to say, okay, we can actually do this. We have the resources to do this. We know how to do this. The rules of the road are clear, and I think we'll see an acceleration of that going forward.
Thank you. Actually, that was going to be my sort of follow-up. Actually, was you'd mentioned all these sort of big ticket companies and businesses, but I guess the real driver, or the real sort of the proof of the pudding, if it were, is if those medium-sized companies really do start to sort of move in. What about competition from neighboring states? I mean, how are they sort of positioned in this sort of quest for FDI and bringing the businesses in? And obviously, we're seeing a push for businesses to set up regional headquarters in Riyadh or elsewhere in the kingdom. How does that sort of play out?
Absolutely. It's one of the things that we gathered information on in the course of our research, though I think we didn't include many details sort of about the regional headquarters push in the paper itself. Obviously, this is something that's been a priority for Saudi Arabia to attract more regional headquarters, especially, saying to a lot of Dubai-based firms that a lot of your business is in Saudi Arabia, your regional headquarters should be in Saudi Arabia as well. I think it makes sense that they will be attracting more of these businesses, from places like the Emirates. A lot of their revenue streams are already from Saudi Arabia, though it doesn't seem to me that it's a zero-sum game. This is a situation where as Saudi Arabia expands its pie, expands sort of the sectors available, not everything that comes to Saudi Arabia is going to be at the expense of another neighboring country.
Great, thank you. And I'm just going to ask one more question, and I'm going to come to Hannah to see if she has a question here. I mean, obviously, you sort of stressed the importance of the relationship and the relationship going forward. But in the global context, would it make more sense to focus or pivot to Asia as it's closer and ultimately a bigger market?
I mean, Saudi Arabia, I believe, is the largest seller of oil to China. I mean, obviously, there are huge equities. Saudi Arabia has huge equities in Asia as well. From my conversations, it is not seen as an either-or proposition. When you talk to Saudi policymakers about these things, they say, absolutely, we want more Asian businesses, but we also want US businesses. And there are things that the US firms provide that Asian firms cannot provide. For example, when you look at a lot of the construction for Vision 2030 projects, just to take that as one example, when you look at the construction in the giga projects, a lot of the design work is being done by American firms. They're still seen, American and British and firms. They're seen as sort of the premier designers of these projects, but the implementation is often done by Asian partners. Korean partners play a particularly strong role. You see it in the automotive market too. The Asian car manufacturers are the dominant players in the Saudi market these days. But I just don't. I think Saudi policymakers and businessmen see benefits from both. When it comes to entertainment, there are U.S. entertainment options that are seen as sort of global brands that other countries cannot match, and they're seen as headlining events in sort of a very prominent way that doesn't have a replacement.
Great, thank you. Thanks, David. Hannah, did you have a question or two you wanted to put to the speakers?
Yeah, sure. So I'm gonna shift a little bit and ask about something that you wrote quite a bit about in the report, but didn't touch on too much right now. Briefly, David, you did mention the number of students in the US, but I guess I'm interested in your opinion kind of on that cultural exchange and what that does kind of to the appetite for US culture in Saudi, and kind of how you see that playing out.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you so much, Dr. Hannah. It's something that came up again and again in my conversations with US diplomats, with US businessmen. First, they would say, we couldn't work in the same way without this deep reservoir of Saudi students who studied in the United States. In some ways, they're our entry into the country. Whether they're businessmen who hire Saudis to sort of to help them understand sort of the local context, or whether they're diplomats who their liaison in a ministry is someone who studied in Kansas or Boston or wherever. They say that it's just incredibly valuable for their ability to sort of access the country. The other part of your question is sort of what does it do to sort of stoke interest in U.S. firms and and sort of cultural options. I think that is partially because I think that the interest in those U.S. cultural options is partially because of U.S. students, Saudi students studying in the U.S., and also the prevalence of satellite television has sort of made these things accessible for a long time. I mean, this is purely anecdotal, but when I talk to my peers in Saudi Arabia, they talk about watching Friends growing up. I mean, they didn't have to travel to New York City, but they were exposed to this from a very young age. But obviously, there is sort of a great appetite for these American culture in the kingdom, either from television or from students studying in the U.S.
To follow up on that, do you see there being kind of the reverse of that happening, and how can Saudi project more, of the actual culture and what is happening, and what are they doing in that space to kind of do something similar in the other direction toward the U.S.?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I think the pandemic threw a wrench in a lot of this, to be totally honest. They had recently implemented their visa on demand for, the visa at the border policies for Americans and other countries. And then the pandemic threw a wrench in international travel. So I think in some ways that makes it difficult to assess the success of current plans to do this. I will say that the number of Americans who travel to Saudi Arabia remains quite low. It's about 80,000 either live or travel to the kingdom every year. The presence of compounds in the kingdom means that a lot of those Americans might not actually be exposed to too much Saudi culture while, in their compound life. So I really do think this is a realm where Saudi Arabia can improve dramatically. I would love to see Arabic language institutes in the kingdom. I think that is one aspect they could sort of seize upon. The Ministry of Investment is doing some really impressive work to improve business owners, U.S. firms' knowledge of how to operate in Saudi Arabia. They've recently opened up branches across the globe and expanded their overseas presence and are aggressively trying to sort of educate U.S. firms and all international firms about how to operate in the kingdom and sort of the business environment in the kingdom. But it really would be wonderful to see more done on the cultural level as well. And I do think the kingdom has plans for that. But I think COVID has made it very difficult in the short term.
Thank you, David. We've got a range of questions coming in at the moment. Some are sort of broader, some are more specific. I'll sort of take them in varying orders and try to bunch a couple together. Here's one. You've spoken a few times about entertainment and sports. So entertainment and sports events have been among the most adversely affected by the pandemic. Company budgets are strained and expansion plans have been put on hold or cancelled. How will this affect progress made so far between Saudi and US in this key sector as you've identified?
Yeah, it's a challenge. There's no denying that it's a challenge, and that these are trying times for all joint ventures, both entertainment, mining, everything. I do think the pandemic's going to end. There's going to come a time when we don't have these challenges, and hopefully we revert to the status quo ante that existed before the pandemic. One thing that I will say is that one reason for bullishness is Saudi government fiscal investment in these projects. We're talking, billions of dollars that are being poured into these programs. And yes, it's absolutely true that they can't operate now, and they've hit a road bump because of that. But these fiscal commitments don't seem like they're going anywhere. So that's one reason for optimism that these sectors are resilient in the long run.
Thank you. Now, I don't know whether you can answer this question. This is very specific, or maybe Camille would be able to answer it. It's given the absence from the Saudi market for many years of the Coca-Cola company and the dominance of Pepsi, and with the progress of positive change in the kingdom due to Vision 2030, do our panelists foresee a forthcoming change in terms of allowing Coca-Cola to enter Saudi Arabia? Very specific questions, so I guess that deserves a very specific answer, if you can.
My specific answer is that sadly I have absolutely no idea.
Me too. Yeah.
I did wonder on that one specifically. And this is again a slightly different type of question, but it's a very important one, of course. Aside from the bilateral trade and investments, do the panelists have any information on US-Saudi cooperation in projects in Iraq? Iraq certainly needs a great deal of assistance, and I was wondering if joint projects are being implemented today around urbanization, environment, energy transition, etc.
I can speak a little bit. So full disclosure, I looked into this about 2 years ago and have not looked into it again. So my information is dated, and my apologies if what I'm going to say is no longer accurate, but I might as well provide the information that I looked into then. The US government was very interested in encouraging Saudi investment into Iraq on a few fronts. First, in formerly ISIS-held areas to sort of boost the economy and reduce the reduce any economic drivers of radicalization in the country, and to sort of help the oil sector get back on its feet. They saw those as the two sectors where Saudi Arabia really had added value and sort of both a humanitarian, economic, diplomatic interest in intervention. I do not know whether these were private, whether there was a US private partner in these efforts, and I apologize for that. What I was looking into was US government encouragement to Saudi Arabia to provide help on these fronts. Anyway, that's what I know. I apologize. It's not precisely what the questioner asked.
Thank you. No, but thank you very much. That's really great. We've got a question coming back to the regional headquarters, and it says, you've mentioned establishing the regional headquarters, not a zero sum when competing with other regional players. Can you elaborate on how that might be?
Yes, absolutely. The regional headquarters, I mean, if you only have one regional headquarter, yes, I suppose that is a zero-sum game. But the market share, the amount of business being done in the GCC countries is not a zero-sum game. These Saudi sectors are expanding fairly dramatically. The pie is growing in Saudi Arabia and the GCC. So the the amount of business that a U.S. firm can do in the region is increasing, and it's not like every $100 of business taken from Saudi Arabia goes into the Emirates, or every $100 from the Emirates goes into Saudi Arabia. With these new sectors and with the expansion of existing sectors such as construction, there really is the opportunity for overall growth in the economic linkages, not just one country at the expense of another country. I hope that answered the question.
That's great. That's really good. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions that sort of follows on from Hannah's questions about, you know, the exchanges and the students. And it'd be nice if we could sort of think about this both ways. As one question is, you know, could you please tell us about the change in Saudi's branding image on the US society? And there's another question that asks about, you know, Saudi students that have studied in the US returning, to what extent do they impact or affect the way that the US is seen or viewed? I mean, I don't know how one measures that, but at least I'm sure you can sort of share that anecdotally, and happy to hear from all three of you on that as well.
I've been talking a lot. Kamal or Dr. Hannah, would anyone else like to take a shot at it?
I can mention something regarding the students and as you mentioned, that how the pandemic affected the entertainment sector, but also the students, the Saudi students traveling to the United States. We mentioned in the report that overall 150,000 Saudi citizens visited the United States in 2019. 59,000 of them are roughly students, but the numbers are very low at this rate right now. Especially when we at the peak of the Saudi students going to the United States, 2015-16, 61,000 Saudi students were studying in the US. That's a huge difference than the years 2003 and 2005. And roughly all these students from 2005 to 2019 contributed to almost $14 billion to the American economy. That's what I have to add.
I would just say that even before you had the scholarship program in the 1960s, you had such a huge influx of Saudi students going to the US. So this is generational. And I do think that, you know, in other research that I have done in speaking to Saudis in kind of that later demographic that, you know, are in their mid 60s today, attribute so much of their kind of work ethic, the values, and a lot of their just kind of outlook to their days studying in the US. So I definitely think that that also then transfers generationally to other, you know, to their children who then go to study abroad. And that maybe stopped for a while, but then with the scholarship program, it was reactivated. And it was, you know, I think one of it's the top destination, and because English is so widely prevalent within the country, it is kind of a no-brainer as a destination. And obviously other parts of Europe, UK would be another one, but I think you know, just the fact that so many students began their journey in the US, that is one of the reasons there's a continuation.
Thank you. That's really good. There are some sort of broader questions coming in asking about sort of, I guess, the direction of travel. I asked David about sort of, you know, a sort of 5-year projection in terms of the economic relationship, but asking specifically about the Biden administration and what that means for that economic relationship. I mean, does that pose any, I mean, will that put any sort of obstacles in the path, or is the relationship so I guess multidimensional that ultimately it doesn't matter? I mean, those are two sort of reductive positions. It would be quite nice to get maybe some flavor or context on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, when you look at the scope of the US-Saudi economic relationship, just in terms of foreign direct investment stock, in terms of US exports, in terms of Saudi holdings of US debt, you really cannot, and let's say you created a chart with all that, and then broke it up based on presidential administration or the state of US-Saudi relations at that time. you would not be able to determine when US-Saudi relations were good and when they were bad based on the level of economic interaction. For example, the Saudi Arabia started buying US Treasury debt at a time when, right after the oil embargo, for example, at a time when the relationship was quite poor, comparatively poor compared to what came after, for example. So I do not really see the Biden administration as representing an obstacle to increased US-Saudi economic cooperation. I think the relationship might be more rocky on a number of fronts, but I don't really see anything they're going to do as affecting the basic trend lines of what's going to happen with the two countries on a business level.
Great, thank you very much. And there's a question, it's not exactly a follow-on, but a bit of a follow-on. How do you appraise the effect of the so-called strategic agreement between China and Iran on the American, Saudi relationship? Is there any sort of a knock-on effect of that one way or another?
It's a good question. I hesitate to answer about something that I haven't considered in great detail. I mean, I guess my sense is that the effect would probably be fairly minor, but if Iran does end up going closer to China, it does seem possible there could be a block between the United States and Saudi Arabia that arises to compete with it on both an economic and political level. But I just want to caveat this by saying that this is not something that I've looked at closely enough to have a really informed opinion about.
Thank you. Camille or Hannah, do you have anything to add to that?
No, thank you.
All right, thank you. We've got a question here. Is there a coordinated US approach to urban development projects in Saudi Arabia, particularly those along the Red Sea? Or is that a matter for the private sector to organize? And I guess that final part of the question is very interesting in light of the announcement yesterday and the role that the private sector is likely to be playing sort of up to 2030 and way beyond. So I'm not sure who would like to take that, but that's a very open question for all three of you, in fact.
I think as a government official, the Ministry of Investments plays a big role into this, especially with their efforts through their offices all over the world. But I will leave the rest of the answer to David.
Thanks, Camille. You give me the hard ones. So I would say, if the question's about US firms' involvement in Saudi urban development, I would say that there's not a centralized sort of US policy or US position or strategy regarding firms' involvement in Vision 2030 projects. In my experience, the U.S. government is often not all that great about sort of tracking what U.S. firms are involved in the kingdom and what these different projects are. The Saudi government, however, is. The Saudi government definitely has a centralized strategy about sort of what firms to bring in, what U.S. firms to bring in, what on what projects, and so I do think the organization is more on the Saudi side than the U.S. side.
Great, thank you. In light of yesterday's announcements, it's sort of picking up on this a little bit. What competitive advantages can or does Saudi Arabia have to offer and promote, and sustain the economic relationship with the US? And I guess that's really sort of talking about the medium to medium size too.
Shall I take this, or does anyone else want to jump in? Anyway, I'll take it, but feel free to interrupt me at any time. So the Saudi Arabia has a number of comparative advantages, I think. There aren't very many untapped markets in the world when it comes to a variety of sectors. Arabia is one. So when looking at when talking to Saudi policymakers involved in these topics, they frame this as sort of the opening up of a previously closed country. In fact, I think that is almost directly a line that I quote from a Ministry of Investment brochure. I think I'm not sure I can find the quote right now. Let me see. They describe Saudi Arabia as a once private nation that is now opening up to the world, and it's a nation with a citizenry who has substantial disposable income, substantial exposure to American and Western culture, and sort of a great wealth of resources, both human resources and resources in the ground. Saudi Arabia is one of the world's leaders in the energy sector and has an incredible depth of experience in that field. It is also the site of the two holy mosques, and the Hajj and Umrah. The Hajj and Umrah represent sort of an experience that cannot be matched for Muslims across the world. And is a major field for tourism and their Saudi Arabia's desire to expand its tourism industry. The other thing I would just say is when we talk about the Red Sea projects, the policymakers emphasize that this is sort of incredible stretches of sort of untapped land that would make great beaches, entertainment, resorts, and that's another strategic advantage that other countries cannot match.
Just to jump in on that, actually, I wanted to say that I think just the intention as well and having the vision as kind of the approach and the strategy for the future does also give Saudi a competitive advantage in that sense that there is an actual active approach to economic diversification and investment in different areas, and also an active approach to investing in a green economy. There's an active approach to changing kind of business as usual within the region, and with the political stability, there is an opportunity for that to have a spillover effect throughout the region. Part of the Vision 2030 policy as well has to do with, basically not only attracting investment from the United States, but also from regional players. And so I think that is an opportunity to really, see as a benefit within the region as a whole.
I may add, following the liberalization of the market in Saudi Arabia and regarding the US business in Saudi Arabia, in 2019, Saudi Arabia issued over 1,100 new investment licenses to foreign companies, a 54% increase over the prior year. Of that number, the US companies claimed 82 licenses, which is the fourth highest number in the world.
Thank you, Camille. In the paper, you really sort of unpack sort of FDI. And my reading of your reading is you present quite a different picture to the one that we're used to seeing when we don't open our broadsheets anymore, but when we switch on our phones, that FDI levels are all-time low or pretty low. But your take, your analysis comes across as quite different to that. Could you sort of maybe unpack that a little bit and talk about confidence in the kingdom sort of securing this FDI going forward?
Yes, absolutely. So my previous paper for the center was actually more directly focused on FDI and regulatory hurdles to FDI. While this paper seemed, I tried to give more of a sense of the hard numbers when it comes to direct investment. Let me just quickly pull up what I wrote so I don't misquote myself. So there are two things that are going on here. One is that if you take the long view, FDI, the US cumulative level of investment in Saudi Arabia has expanded quite dramatically over the past 2 decades. It sits at 10.8 billion in 2019. It was 3.7 billion in 2000. So yes, there are obviously ups and downs. It's very easy to look at specific times when it went down, specific times when it went up, and sort of have a short-term mentality about these things. But the overall trend is that it's gone up fairly significantly. Obviously, and this is pulling a little bit from the previous paper I wrote, global FDI has been down in emerging markets across the world in recent years. And I think we do see that in Saudi numbers as well, though I don't have the figures in front of me. But the overall trend line over time is going up.
Great, thank you. We've got a question here. I'm not sure that I would agree with it, or the panel will. So it'll be interesting to hear actually from each of you how you would sort of characterize this. Why is the relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia, why does it become stronger when there's a Republican president in the White House, and weaker and there are tensions when you have a Democrat president in the White House? I mean, maybe that's true. I'm not absolutely sure. We get a similar question here when we have a conservative party, conservative government, or a Labour government. And that often does affect things. So what are your take? It would be interesting to hear from sort of a US perspective and a Saudi perspective on that.
Dr. Hanna, want to take this first, and then I'll jump in afterwards?
I don't necessarily think it's true. However, I mean, in general, I think looking at economic interests, that's what a lot of the Republican presidents are going to kind of talk about, is specifically kind of what can be done in terms of economic cooperation, whereas potentially a Democratic administration will be answering to Congress, who is more interested in other social issues that, you know, might in some way kind of maybe have louder voices than the ones advocating for economic interests. But I don't know, David, if you have a different
I would certainly co-sign what you just said about the preference of Republicans for economic expansion over the prioritization of, for example, whether it's environmental concerns or other concerns. Just more business, more jobs, and anything to do that is better. And obviously that benefits Saudi Arabia in some ways. I would say the public, I would not confuse necessarily the public rhetoric between the two countries with the relationship between the two countries. I really do think that they're quite different things. The US relationship with Saudi Arabia proceeded perfectly fine under the Clinton administration. There were differences under the Obama administration, of course, but it's not like the alliance collapsed. And I think we'll probably see the same under the Biden administration. Absolutely, it will be less publicly warm, but you still have these economic ties. You still have a lot of diplomatic, political coordination that goes on, even if the public rhetoric between the two countries isn't as warm as it once was.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question from one of our colleagues at the center. I've sort of been saving it for towards the end, at least. So he says, you know, there's no doubt that Saudi-American relations are going to improve. So that's a very positive thing. I wonder how both countries can continue to do so in terms of foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East. Obviously, that wanders from the scope of your paper specifically, but it would be helpful to sort of, you know, get your thoughts on that.
Okay. I think the two countries have a natural interest in an economically vibrant, sort of sustainable order in the Middle East. I think there are certainly very strong interests in Iraq, for one. There's an interest in building up an economic bloc of the GCC states that can help contain Iran. I think that there is an interest in sort of a united GCC that can sort of speak with one voice. I think the countries have an incredible range of interests that they can work together in the Middle East. I'm sorry, I'm not. It's a little bit beyond the scope of my paper. I don't have sort of specific examples beyond that, but yeah, I do think that there's a whole range of cooperation that can go on. I'm sure other people can offer more eloquent answers than I.
Thanks, David. A question for Camille and Hannah, and that's, I mean, is there since the Biden administration's come into being, I mean, have we sort of seen an evidence of a new approach to promoting sort of soft power in the US? We've talked about sort of, you know, the student exchanges and how effective those have been both ways. But has there been any sort of concerted efforts at sort of managing that space?
I think the Saudi governments do realize that the exchange of students or the Saudi students going to the United States is playing a good play on promoting the soft power there, and that's how when they announce a new scholarship program this year, contributing to this effort. And I would like to see if Hannah has an answer to that.
Well, potentially travel as well. I mean, I do think that under the Trump administration, there was the Muslim travel ban, if you will, and therefore there was a lot of kind of reluctance of Saudis to even go to the US, maybe a fear, maybe visas were being delayed. I know there was a huge backlog for a very long time for many people. So I think that potentially could be changing. I think it's early days still. However, I would kind of echo what David said in terms of being careful not to see kind of what public, you know, to take the public rhetoric and the media's portrayal of the relationship as what's actually happening. But I think that travel and the exchange of students and also, you know, just the continued exchange of culture through media is definitely going in this a positive direction.
Thank you, Hannah. David, Camille, thank you very much for these presentations. If I could just impose upon you just 90 seconds each, just to sort of, you know, summarize the components of your paper and maybe a little bit sort of forward thinking, that will be super. That's a little bit harsh to sort of throw that on you at the last. But if you've got 90 seconds, maybe David, if we start with you and then we sort of finish up with Camille, that would be a great way to do it. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. You know, I think the main takeaway for me from the paper is that the relationship really is more than arms and oil, as the title says. That the arms and oil stand in for the security relationship. That to put in incredibly superficial terms, America offers regional protection to Saudi Arabia, and in return, Saudi Arabia sells the oil that fuels the US economy and the global economy. And while that's not wrong in some ways, though superficial, the relationship really is far more diverse, and the two countries are far more interconnected than that image portrays. And my other main takeaway from the paper is that the relationship is getting more diverse and the two countries are getting more interconnected every day. And I really do see all the trends point to that accelerating going forward. I could continue, but I think that's probably about 90 seconds.
Thank you very much. And then Camille.
Well, if I'm going to talk, I'm going to just repeat what David said. I just want to be very thankful for those who have read the report and shared with us their comments and feedback. And just want to say stay tuned for more special reports from KF-Class.
Oh, thank you very much. David, Camille, thank you for sharing the report. It's online. The link has been shared in the Q&A section. So I would encourage all of our sort of audience today to download it and read it if you haven't done so already. Hannah, thank you so much for opening this and also contributing to the conversation and asking questions. And until the next time, this is me signing off. Thank you very much indeed. Have a good afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.